Right, must continue with this project now, I suppose. Let's see what I'm up to. Here's the rewind shaft. I suppose that can go back on the camera. Is that 2 screws or 3? 3. Right, we'll just give that a quick wipe down. Just removing any dust and dirt and old grease. Now the inner section of this I'll demonstrate. The rewind knob screws on there. The inner section pulls up to allow you to rewind your film easily. If you pull up any more, of course, the whole shaft pulls up out of the film cassette. I've got to make sure that the inner moves freely on the main shaft. So I'll remove the screw that locates it. That should pull straight out. It does. And I could tell while I was pulling that out that it was quite sticky with dried grease. I want that off. I want that to move quite freely. That should clean that out. I'll put a thin smear of synthetic grease on that component, slide it back into place and pop its locking screw or guide screw into position. That screw is like no other in the camera, so take great care not to lose it. You won't find a replacement easily. Just check that that in fact does move smoothly. It does, that's good. Now this section here, I don't recommend removing this to clean it, because getting this little ring here off and back on again is a pain. It's just not easy. The ring tends to get distorted and then doesn't want to go back where you put it. So I've just cleaned that shaft, put a little bit of synthetic grease on it, pop that back in place and check that it revolves smoothly. And it does. That's good. So that's our rewind shaft, and that can go back onto the camera body. Has 3 screws fix that. And screwdriver is magnetic, and magnetic screwdrivers are sometimes a help and sometimes a hindrance. I'll get these 3 screws started. Once they're started, I can do them up tight. If you just go ahead and do the first one up tight, you'll probably find that you have trouble inserting the second screw. And even if you get the second screw installed, you'll probably have trouble inserting the third screw. If you get them all started first, then tighten them up, you'll find that life goes much smoother. There we go, that's that part done. Our film take-up spool, let's close that front up. Sits in here. So we have our spool, and that looks a bit dirty. The spool is Bakelite. If it's not Bakelite, it's some similar thermosetting plastic. Just clean that. And I'll clean both the spring and the bush that it rides on in the centre there, that post. Make sure they're clean. Apply a little bit of fresh grease, particularly to that post. Apply some to the top of that spring. That's where it keeps pressure against the film take-up spool. And drop that spool into place, making sure it's sitting there correctly. That's good. Our take-up film advance shaft, if you like, is this piece. That boss on the bottom couples to the film take-up spool. Here's the guide bush that supports it. And that's held in place with 3 screws. Countersunk head screws, probably the most common size and shape throughout the camera. That one looks a bit small. That does not look quite right. Let's have a look at that one again. I think that's a foreigner from somewhere. No, I think that'll be alright. Often with old cameras, particularly cameras made in times when things were in short supply, like immediately after the Second World War, all sorts of parts get put into service that at other times may have been rejected as not quite being up to standard. Often, of course, that's just unnecessary fussiness. The fact that these 3 screws do not look identical is quite probably something that would only be noticed by someone who sees an awful lot of them. A little bit of corrosion there. I'm just checking to see if that'll come away. That bush, of course, is nickel plated. There's no serious corrosion there. I'll apply some synthetic grease to that film advance shaft. Pop it in place in the bush. That runs nice and smoothly. Now this we have to get seated into the top of the film advance spool. Sometimes it'll just jump in by itself like that. That's good. Other times you have to open the back of the camera to guide it in. That's good. That revolves smoothly, that's all good. What else have we got? Oh, all sorts of exciting stuff now. I'll clean some of these components up and get them all in place. These are the components that meter the film as it travels through the camera, if you like, so that once the requisite number of sprocket holes have passed the gate, that it locks the film advance. Now, what else do I need to do? Just wondering whether I'm putting everything here in the right order. We do have to put in the sprocket shaft here. It might be useful to put the sprocket shaft in first. I think I might do that. Sometimes I don't take the sprocket shaft out of the body. If everything is clean and tidy and showing no problems, I will often leave it in place. That's the washer from that, that's good. Okay, we just clean up these components. Just looking at this shaft. A few little marks on there, but I'm just checking to see if there's anything serious, and there's not. I thought there might be corrosion, but in practice it was just a patch of grease or oil. Okay, I'll put a little bit of synthetic grease in the top of the body there. I'll put some right at the bottom of that shaft. That revolves in the casting at the bottom of the camera, which of course we have now helpfully covered over. So feed in the sprocket shaft from the top. The first thing that goes on here is a little washer. It's a spacer. The second thing is our sprocket. And then down in this recess here we have this roller here. It's just a simple roller. That shaft should drop down into the pocket in the bottom of the body. And now I'll do up these two screws, these two grub screws. The grub screws here are not pointed. They do not line up with any particular point on that shaft. Unlike on some other cameras where there'll actually be a hole in the shaft that they couple to. It really doesn't want to move much. Move that up a bit. This roller at the bottom in particular, I'm taking care to get that centered in there. It should be below the area of the film that gets exposed, so it's probably sitting slightly high there. I'll move it down a bit, otherwise you may end up with a visible line on the film. I'm just lining it up here now with that with the film gate. Oh, I'll bring it down a bit further. That's fine. The top one is located against the body. That spacer washer that's in there determines how far up it can go. Just checking that revolves smoothly, no catching, nothing wrong there. That's good. Back where we were. Here I'm just cleaning the components individually, inspecting them. This is the advanced retard setting lever. A little bit of corrosion on it right there. Nothing serious. Just making sure there are no lumps and bumps. We'll just treat that as being a blemish in the chrome. It won't be the worst blemish on this camera by any means. And it'll have absolutely no effect on operation. If there's any corrosion on parts like this, particularly it's because they're at the top of the camera, almost certainly the camera's been caught out in the rain and water, raindrops have run around the advance knob and settled on surfaces and allowed them to get corroded up. Alright, so we have this little wheel here. This is actually two wheels riveted together. They're opposite each other, they're ratchets. Doesn't matter which way up you flip this, it's going to be the right way. So that can just pop straight on. Our components here need to be cleaned along with their spacer washers and the shaft they sit on, which I think is, oh, there's two of them here and they look much the same. To make sure I choose the right one, that's for that one. Yes, we'll have this piece too, I think. Clean these up. Zoom you in a bit. Again, it's useful to clean these parts by hand. It gives you the opportunity to, or forces you almost, to look at them closely, and then you will notice if there's any problem with any of the components. The sorts of problems I'd be looking for would be something that was bent or cracked or corroded. Any corrosion to the extent that the parts may not move smoothly would be something you would need to deal with. This little wheel here and its related shaft is geared to the top of the sprocket shaft here. It fits here, it's geared to that, and as that revolves it's got a small cam on it, and as that cam falls into place, components like this drop in on that cam and lock the film advance and stop you from pulling more film through the camera. Now, something worth noting is that the metering of the amount of film going through camera, in other words the spacing between frames, is very much a function of how quickly the teeth on these arms drop into the point on the arms drops in and locks the advance shaft here. So if things are worn, then that tooth might not drop in on the first tooth, it might drop in on the second one. Likewise, if things are sticky, it might not drop into the first opportunity, it might be slow, it might be a bit sticky, it might drop into the second one. So a film advance on a camera like this is much more likely to have slightly inconsistent frame spacing compared with a camera, say like the Retina 2A, where all the metering is done directly from the sprocket shaft, which the relationship of the teeth on the sprocket shaft to the position of the stuff at the top is a fixed ratio. In a case like this, it's not. So don't be surprised if you get slight variation in frame spacing with an early camera like this. That's quite normal. And it doesn't indicate a fault unless it's severe. It indicates life as we know it. So I have to pop these levers into there's 3 levers stack up here, and they have washers between them. And the washers have to be in the correct position. Otherwise, stuff doesn't work or doesn't work correctly. So here I'm trying to get this post down through 3 levers and 2 washers and finding the hole in the top plate. It's a stepped post, of course, so it has to travel through the washers without getting them caught underneath it. That feels right. I'll just nip that up. I'm checking the action of these levers relative to each other, noticing that they are loose and free to move. That's correct. If they were stiff, I would have to investigate the cause. Now we have 2 springs that look much the same as each other here. These 2. These 2 springs here. Move you into the picture a bit. Now they look similar to each other. They're not the same. This one goes to the back of the camera. This one goes to the front of the camera. Try not to mix them up. Otherwise you'll have trouble getting things working. The springs are held in place by identical shouldered screws in both cases. I'm lifting the spring underneath this arm at the back and behind it. You can see how it operates to keep that lever in contact with the gear. Just hit a file size limit there. I was just saying that this spring keeps this lever in contact with the gear. This is the rewind lever, holds this out and allows your shaft to rotate backwards, otherwise it can only rotate forwards. Our other spring fits here. And that has to hook under this lever. There's a stud on that lever. This spring has to hook underneath that stud and acts to pull this lever forward. It's awkward to get the spring tucked back under there. There it is. Our rewind lever goes on the camera here, and it's held in place with this component which screws down onto the advance shaft. It's getting that centered up. That's better. I'll do that up tight. So I want my spanner. And I need the pair of pliers for doing that. So the spanner has to go onto the flaps on the top of the advance shaft, just on top of the take-up spool. If I can get it in place. I don't know what size they machine these things to. They're a little bit, that's better, it's in place now. A bit variable. This is left hand threaded. That's it. In this position is the rewind position. Pulls this lever out of contact with the ratchet so that you can rewind the film. As you advance the film, it rotates this, pulls this lever back out of the way, allows the ratchet to drop back in place so that the film will not go backwards. That's all good. Just check the action of that. I'll put a little bit of molybdenum paste on that cam surface. There's a cam surface just above the teeth of the gear on this wheel, and that cam surface operates this lever, pulling it back out of the way, which frees up the shutter release to allow you to depress the shutter release. And I think I've just about come to the end of the molybdenum in my container, and I'll have to fill it up again. So I'll just run it around that cam surface at the front. It requires very little, that's more than an adequate amount. As our shutter release comes down, this is held in the cocked position, if you like, ready to release the shutter. As the shutter comes down, it pulls back this lever, which acts to release this from the cam, which means that the cam is then free to revolve again as you turn the advance knob. And as this comes forward, it also blocks the action of the shutter release. It comes back up, but it can't depress again until this has been pulled back by the next advance of the film. You can put the advance knob on there for testing purposes. There we go. And then the shutter would come down. That would drop out of action. We could wind on to the next frame. And so forth. So the film advance components are all in place there. The shutter release is not. The shutter release on this model. What have we got here? Just making sure we've got all the components, and there's not many here to worry about. There's no return spring on this. This part is quite dirty. this camera and the Retina one that I was also, that came from the same source, had probably been living in someone's display case for a decade or three, I would think. Certainly hasn't been in use because it was not fit for use, and is certainly quite dirty. Once I've got all that grime off, I can inspect it closely and see if there's any problem with corrosion. Again, I'll be looking for problems with corrosion that would cause functional problems, cause some roughness in something that needed to move smoothly. That's far more important than the look of a component like this, since it is internal to the camera and cannot be seen. The last person to see it would have been the last person to service the camera. And if you're not servicing the camera, you never need to be any the wiser. Alright, so I'll put some molybdenum on there. This drops in place. Let's make sure it goes over the shaft, down on the struts mechanism there, so that as the shutter release is depressed, let's pull this into position. It's in the cocked position now. As I press this release here, you'll see the shutter release here go down. And you probably also heard that lever pop, so that I could wind on the film to the next shot. So that part is all in place. What else have we got here? Our frame counter, that sits on that post. That's all right. Right, I think here the next thing of interest is probably the rangefinder. So I'll clean up the rangefinder and then fit that back to the body. Then we can put the rest of the components into the top of the camera and close up the top of the camera. The leather's all glued back to the front now, neat and tidy. The camera looks much, much better.